move on to the other thing that people just forget, tires. No matter what it says on the side of the tire, every tire has a different circumference. So the problem is, if you find tires or you're testing tires, before you do anything, measure the circumference of the tire in the center and make notes of where your chassis is. So if we're through, for example, here, 8 mil, and we check the ride height in the back, and we put a 180 set of Michelins on the back, what's all that geometry set up? Then if you want to move to a 190 because you need more traction, measure the circumference of the 190 and then look at the chassis. What did it do to the chassis? How much did it pick the back up? Now, Michelins and Dunlops are pretty similar. Metzeler's and Pirelli's are the other end of the spectrum because those have a big front tire and a small rear tire. So if I was going to switch these out and put a Dunlop 209, this bike is already pitched up this way. I put a 209 on it, which is going to grow 5 to 7 millimeters when it gets hot as well. The rider's going to go about 90 miles an hour and feel the bars start to do this. And you cannot ride through it. So that's another way of figuring out what happened to the chassis if you didn't measure it. Tires is probably the #1 thing that causes unbelievable amounts of problems, but nobody throws a tape measure around a tire to figure out what happened. And all it takes is a couple minutes, because then you can see exactly what happened to the chassis. And if you don't have adjustability in the back, you can always raise or lower the front end using the forks and measure it out in increments to get that stability back in the chassis and get the balance from this to this, or if you're going the other way, to bring the chassis up. Now, most modern sport bikes do have at the top of the shock a post that you can shim and put washers under if you want to keep the bike up. Obviously, if you're using the front end, you're going to lose ground clearance if you drop in the front to create geometry. So it's much nicer now because you can take the nut off, pull the post out, shim it, and pick the back of the bike up and keep your ground clearance. So that's really is critical. The other thing that goes along with that gets missed is gearing. If you've got the tire set, you're staying with the brand and size, you go to different tracks, you have to change gearing. Well, then your wheelbase shrinks or lengthens, either way. You have to account for that with the geometry of the chassis. So if all of a sudden you've got to drop 3 teeth in the back, the wheel is going to move back 6 to 9 millimeters. So now you've got a flat chassis again, so you've got to pick it up. Again, people don't do that. They slap the gearing on, go. It won't turn. I get on the gas, it runs wide. And then you have to go back in and evaluate what you did or what the other person did to understand what the hell happened and why. So usually, for a rule of thumb, if you go back 9 millimeters, you need about 2 millimeters of ride height in the back to pick it up. That's an approximate way of ballparking it and starting. Somewhere in that range. Now again, it depends on the individual. It depends how hard they run the front, how big their corner speed is, or especially with somewhere like Miller where it's tremendous terminal speed, the overall stability of the chassis is more important. The last thing you need is at the end of that straight to start getting a wobble when you want to get on the brakes. If you have to back out at all, then you've got a problem. So you need to sort that out. The other thing about gearing is actually chain tension. For a track bike, you should have at least 1 inch of tension, 1 inch of slack in the chain, because the suspension has to go through 3.5, 4 inches or more of travel. If you have any less than that, the chain will bind. When it binds, you're done with shock travel. All you got left is the tire. It's just the same as if you bottom the front end, there's nothing left but the tire. So actually making sure you have the correct amount of slack in the chain is very critical to making sure the chassis performs correctly. And on this one, we got probably 3/4 of an inch, so on the track, that'll bind. And you won't get the full shock travel, and you witness that with a zip tie on the shock shaft. You probably get 70% out of this shock, and then it'd quit. It'd be done because the chain would just lock it like you put a steel rod in there. So when you get a set of tires, and you like them, stick with them. Learn the ambient pressure of the day. Take notes on what your cold starting pressure was for the day. Take notes on what your pressure gain was as the temperature raised. Or if you're using nitrogen, get a pyrometer so you can check tire temperature on all the surface of the tire. Tires cost way too much money for the track. You can really destroy a set of tires in 20 minutes, so it's a throwaway. And unfortunately, Michelins are sensitive to half a pound. So if you get it wrong, it's going to tear right away, which is a good thing because you can see it. You can look at your notes. You can see what you've got. You can check the hot pressure as soon as you get off the track. And a general rule of thumb is 5 to 7 pounds gain from cold to hot. If you can keep it in that window, for the most part, the tire should wear pretty evenly. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a projector, so I've got lots of tire pictures, but they're all on the website. And you will see a different tire tearing patterns all there for you to look at. So you can use that if you want to pull it down and keep that sheet with you, and you go out to a track and you run it and it deforms, odds on one of the 4 or 5 patterns that are there will resemble what you've got. So catch it right away. At the end of each session, eyeball your tires. Make sure the wear is even. If it is, you can carry on. If it doesn't look right, you've got a problem, so you need to fix it right away. Race tires are extremely susceptible to that, and in 20 minutes, they're gone. You can absolutely destroy a rear tire in 20 minutes. Less if it's a bigger CC bike. So keeping an eye on your tires is absolutely critical. Now, lastly, and perhaps most importantly, which most people don't deal with because it's too technical, is actually dealing with rake and trail and swing arm angle. So this is where it gets a lot more technical, and I'll just cover this in brief. This particular bike with a 675 has an insert. So you can, if you have machining skills, change your swing arm pivot point to raise or lower that swing arm. Now, everything we've mentioned before, gearing, geometry, is all tied into this. So if your swing arm pivot point is standard, you move the chassis back, move the axle back, change the chassis, jack the chassis back up. That's going to bring the swing arm angle back. So for most bikes, you're looking between 10 and 12.5 degrees. 11 to 12.5 is really preferable for the track, because the last thing you want to do when you get on the gas is make the swing arm go flat. You've got no more drive at that point. The leverage ratio on the shock quits working for you. It's working against you at that point. So on some motorcycles, they have eccentrics and everything else, or inserts where you can pick up the swing arm angle. Rake and trail really is the pitch of the front end. How close is it to the exhaust? How quick do you want the bike to actually physically steer? So in this instance, the forks are through quite a way, so this is going to require extremely sensitive counter steering on this particular setup. The bad side of that is that it's going to turn awesome, but when you hit the brakes, there's going to be a huge weight transfer to the front. So a way of getting the best of both worlds is to put a steering head eccentric in. Ducatis do it all the time, and race triple clamps do as well, to kick the front end out to make it more stable and increase the trail. So then the bike retains the angle in the steering head, but actually has the front wheels further out. So you can break the hell out of it and it'll turn instantly. So when you get to a point of wanting to race, bikes like this need 1 to 2 degrees extra trail and rake to kick the front end out over 100 millimeters because it's too short. Similarly, the swing arm needs to come up on this bike by 3 to 5 millimeters. So you've got to make your own inserts for it. But like everything else, if you've got Suzuki's or Ducatis, they're available. Kawasaki's, you can just go to the aftermarket and find them. So refining a chassis based on your riding style is also possible. But that's a real sophisticated end of the spectrum where you're talking about AMA type application to the chassis to get it to work perfectly. And that may sound familiar to you through someone like GMD that has suite numbers where they set the chassis up given criteria that they say the chassis works best in for rake and trail and swing arm angle. If you never get to that, it doesn't matter. If you get to setting the bike up right, get the sag right, the correct springs, balance the chassis with rebound, and then pay attention to your zip tie travel, the motorcycle will do anything you want it to do. And the goal is that you can ride the motorcycle and not think about what it's doing when you're on the track. All you're thinking about is throttle, brake, apex, exit. If you're thinking about the bike at all, there's something wrong. And then you have to figure out, what am I thinking? Or in what part of the corner or under what condition is this bike making me pay attention to it? And then that's easily fixable. But there's so much going on when you're taking laps. Even when you're riding on the street, there's even more going on. So it's even harder to pay attention to what the chassis is doing. Track days are great because you can get out in a safe environment, work the chassis, and then learn about how it's working for you. Probably the last part of that rake trail geometry is that feedback to some riders is everything. Every bump in the track they want, every change in the rolling surface, camber changes, they want all of that information, everything. So they know what the bike is doing every 100th of a second. Some riders cannot stand that. It's too much, sensory overload. So using compression damping, if in general you soften the chassis, it will take feedback away from the bike. Similarly, if you're running Dunlops and it's too much information, you can put Pirellis or Metzeler's on and the track got smooth all of a sudden. It's gone. There's no bumps. The carcass is soft. It absorbs everything in the track. So that's where it comes back to changing tires. What you get, be happy with and stick with. So feedback, you can do it two ways. Tires, change the compound carcass, or change the compression settings. But again, what you do to the front, you need to do to the back to keep it balanced. And if the chassis is out of balance, it'll tell you. All right, that's fundamental setup 101 in a nutshell.